Today I'll be going over Chapter 9 of Nancy Rook's book, Inside Graceland. Chapter 9 is titled, Home for the Last Time. In the days after Elvis was buried, life at Graceland slowly began returning to a routine, but it would never feel the same as before. Nancy writes, After all, even though Elvis was gone, his family still continued to reside there. His grandmother, Minnie Mae, along with his Aunt Delta, was still very much alive. And though Vernon had his own house at the time of Elvis's death, he still maintained the office out back and used the mansion as if it was his own. The office still had to be maintained and business had to be conducted even though Elvis was gone. Bills still had to be paid. Fans still wrote in asking for pictures. Schedule still had to be maintained. And, of course, Lisa Marie would continue to visit. Additionally, Charlie Hodge was still living at the house, as periodically were other members of Elvis's entourage. She says the staff felt it was their responsibility to keep Graceland comfortable for them because they believed Elvis would have wanted things to continue much the same as when he was alive. Nancy couldn't recall exactly how many months it took, but returning to what felt like, quote, normal at Graceland happened very slowly. She says a deep sense of loss filled the house, and for a long time, Nancy found herself speaking in a hushed tone as if Elvis had just died that day. It was hard to continue their usual routines because everything had changed, yet the staff still had the same responsibilities to carry out. The biggest change was obviously if Elvis was no longer physically present, but unusual things began happening after his death. Nancy says she doesn't normally believe in the supernatural, but she admits that some events after Elvis's death left her feeling uneasy more than once. She believed the strange events couldn't be dismissed as coincidence because many other people reported seeing or hearing similar things. When Nancy first started working at Graceland, she was told by some of the maids that Elvis's mother Gladys still, quote, inhabited the house. And Minnie Mae also believed she had seen and heard things that convinced her Gladys's spirit was watching over Elvis at Graceland. Nancy writes, Being very skeptical, I didn't believe them. After several months, however, I wasn't so sure. I started hearing footsteps upstairs when I knew that no one was up there, or I would hear a faint voice coming from a room, and when I would go in to see who it was, there would be no one there. Nancy would find herself saying, I know you're here, Mrs. Gladys, and that's okay. One day she said it out loud and caught herself, then looked around to make sure no one saw her talking to thin air. But she says she never truly felt afraid of the strange occurrences, though they could be unsettling, especially when she was alone at night. Over time, she became somewhat used to the strange occurrences and assumed they were likely just her imagination. Okay, so this next part I'm going to read, she jumps back into a time when Elvis was still alive. I don't know why it's written this way because when I first read it, I thought it happened after Elvis had passed, but what she explains, it happened when he was still alive. Nancy writes, It hadn't helped things any when several days after hearing someone who wasn't there, Elvis decided to try out something new, which he often did. He had been told by someone that you could reach a dearly departed one by burning candles in their memory, and that it also helped to ward off bad spirits. He went through several days and nights where he burned a lot of candles as well as incense up in his bedroom, trying to communicate with Gladys. Nancy said that going into Elvis's bedroom in those few days felt unsettling. It was dark, cold as usual, and smelled of smoke and incense. On top of that, she had to spend hours cleaning candle wax that had dripped onto the furniture and carpet. She was afraid he might burn the house down. She was used to occasional unusual happenings like that in the house, but she says she was not prepared for the even stranger events that occurred after Elvis's death. Nancy writes, About 2 weeks after the funeral, I was cleaning the TV room down in the basement. I had just finished dusting the yellow countertop on the bar, located right inside the small hallway at the bottom of the stairs, when suddenly I heard the door leading into the laundry room slam shut. I not only heard it, I also felt it due to the way the air moves through the little hallway when a door is opened or closed. It slammed shut with such force that I assumed someone was mad and had slammed it deliberately. It took me less than a second to step into the hallway to see who it was. Plenty of time to see if someone was in the hallway. There was no one there. She assumed someone had gone into the laundry room and opened the door expecting to find Aunt Delta or Charlie inside, but it was dark, and when she turned on the light, the room was empty. She ran upstairs and found Aunt Delta reading a magazine in the jungle room, and Aunt Delta too was surprised at the loud door slamming. Nancy asked her if she had seen anyone come up the stairs. Aunt Delta said, No, Nancy, no one else has been up those stairs except you. Was that you slamming the door down there? Nancy was so shaken by what had happened that she couldn't even explain it to Aunt Delta because she didn't understand it herself. Nancy writes, another time, a month or so later, I was in the trophy room at night by myself and started feeling a little dizzy. It felt like the flu was coming on, and I decided to lie down on one of the raised platforms until I felt better. After lying down for a little while, I began feeling worse and closed my eyes thinking that would help me feel better. As I lay there, I felt someone pulling on my foot as if to wake me up. She remembers thinking it was Aunt Delta, who may have thought she was taking a nap and she'd get in trouble. But when she opened her eyes, no one was there, and she is certain someone pulled on her leg. Nancy said there are several other unexplained events, such as trophy case lights turning on and off by themselves, the front doorbell ringing at night with no one there, and the kitchen lights swinging back and forth for no clear reason. Nancy acknowledges that people might think she was crazy for sharing these stories, but she insists the strange events did happen. Even today, friends who still work at Graceland report similar experiences to her, leaving her to accept that some things there may never be explained. Nancy reminded herself that Elvis was no longer at Graceland and had been buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, but that was about to change. Soon after Elvis was buried, Nancy arrived at work and found Vernon, Aunt Delta, and Dodger gathered in the dining room looking visibly upset. Nancy writes, I was told that an attempt had been made the night before to try and steal Elvis's body. Apparently, the police had been notified of the plan and had caught 3 young men walking towards Elvis's mausoleum, carrying some tools to try and break into the crypt. From what I was told later, apparently the attempt was not considered a real threat, but it was enough to cause concern for Vernon. He had mentioned to several of us that he was very worried about Elvis and Gladys's graves being vulnerable to mischief or damage by curiosity seekers. He had even hired security for the cemetery, but that didn't seem to work well enough to satisfy his concerns. And now this. It was decided that Elvis and Gladys would be moved to the grounds of Graceland, specifically to the meditation garden near their swimming pool, where security could be better controlled. The area had once been a grape vineyard before Elvis bought the property, and he later landscaped it into a quiet place for the family. Vernon initially thought he could simply call the funeral home and have Elvis and Gladys moved to Graceland, but it turned out to be more complicated than that. The funeral home told Vernon that because Graceland was zoned residential, he would first need to have the property rezoned to allow burials there. Nancy writes, I heard him on the phone one morning talking to someone at the funeral home, and he seemed very upset that he couldn't just pay to have it done. He eventually got off the phone, and as I was walking by, he said to me, Nancy, they don't seem to understand. I need to bring my son and his mama home. It was not really as if he was talking to me in particular. I just happened to be there at that time, and I think he was just venting his frustration. He had tears in his eyes as he spoke. I remember thinking to myself how old and tired he looked. She told him something to the effect of, Mr. Vernon, I'm sure you'll find a way. And he did. Vernon was determined to move Elvis and Gladys to Graceland. And after several months spending money, gaining neighbor approval, and applying pressure where needed, he finally obtained the permits to bring them home. After coordinating with the funeral home and cemetery, 2 white hearses and 2 limousines arrived at Graceland through the back gates on the evening of October 2nd. The move was moved up a day to avoid media attention after reporters learned of the plan. Only a few reporters near the gate saw the small procession enter through the back entrance before the gates closed behind them. Nancy writes, we had watched throughout the day as a small group of workmen had used a backhoe and shovels to dig the 2 openings in the ground in the meditation garden area. A few bushes had to be removed and some minor landscaping done to accommodate the new graves. Also, some electrical lines had to be rerouted prior to the graves being dug. Vernon had decided to have the area made available for a total of 4 graves, the 2 being dug for Elvis and Gladys, and the 2 remaining for himself and his mother, Minnie Mae. After digging the grave openings, we watched as a small crane was driven to the end of the drive, running parallel to the swimming pool area. A flatbed truck was then backed up as close to the crane as it could get, and 2 very large burial vaults were hoisted, the first one with white chalk marked Elvis, and then the second one marked Gladys, into the 2 waiting openings in the ground. The lids were then placed off to the side, out of sight. Nancy and several employees looked at the open vault after the workers left, and she remembers the eerie feeling of knowing Elvis would soon be placed there for his final resting place. She noticed how deep the vaults were, and as she looked into Elvis's vault, the sunlight briefly reflected off the copper interior, creating a quick flash of golden light. Already feeling uneasy, Nancy was startled by the sudden flash of light and quickly stepped back, shaken by the unnerving experience before returning to the house. Even a month and a half later, Vernon was deeply grieving still, and the process of moving Elvis and Gladys to Graceland, which he knew Elvis would have wanted, was emotionally difficult for him. When Vernon came into the kitchen for coffee that Sunday morning, Nancy could see the heavy strain and grief on his face. He said to her, "Nancy, I know I'm doing the right thing, but it doesn't make it any easier." Vernon went to the cemetery that afternoon to personally oversee the removal of the 2 caskets, making sure everything was handled properly as he completed what he felt he had to do. Nancy writes, "It was a tough decision to have Elvis actually buried in the ground. Elvis had always said that he did not want to be buried in the ground. I had heard him say that on several occasions, as had a number of other friends and family members. That was why Vernon had bought an above-ground crypt at Forest Hill Cemetery and had him buried there when he died." Vernon had first considered building an above-ground crypt in the meditation garden, but after seeing the high cost estimates, he realized the estate didn't have enough money to build it. Vernon and Grandma had already decided the meditation garden would be the final resting place for Elvis, Gladys, and eventually themselves. However, Vernon felt that if a mausoleum were built for Elvis, it would need to be quite grand due to Elvis's status. Nancy heard that one estimate for the mausoleum exceeded $1 million, and many believed the prices were inflated because the project was for Elvis. It was something Vernon often encountered when trying to arrange anything related to him. Another reason for choosing a below-ground burial was security, since digging up a grave would require heavy equipment and be much harder than breaking into an above-ground crypt if someone tried to steal Elvis's body again. Vernon felt an added burden because he could not fulfill Elvis's wish not to be buried in the ground, which weighed heavy on him. At the same time, he also had to carry out another difficult task while preparing for the move back to Graceland. While planning to move Elvis and Gladys back, Vernon was also troubled by the thought that Elvis's twin brother, Jesse Guerin, who had died at birth, would remain in Mississippi. Nancy writes, "Because of their lack of money, Vernon had been forced to bury his other son in an unmarked grave in Priceville Cemetery back in Tupelo. Grandma had told me the heartbreaking story of how they had been so poor that they could not even afford a casket to bury little Jesse in, and how they had buried him in a small cardboard box. The family had remained so poor during the early years that they were never able to buy a headstone for him." This had long troubled Vernon, and since he was bringing Elvis and their mother back to Graceland, he hoped to also locate Jesse Guerin's remains and bring him home so the family could be together. Around mid-September, Vernon and several family members made 2 trips to Priceville Cemetery in Tupelo to trying to locate Jesse Guerin's grave. Vernon hired a funeral home to relocate Jesse's remains along with the rest of his family to Graceland if the grave could be found. But over time, any clues to its exact location had disappeared. Nancy writes, "It was never located, and Vernon, with a heavy heart, finally came into the kitchen the night of his second failed trip to Tupelo and announced to everyone that they would have to settle on a memorial plaque instead to honor the memory of his second son. I did see the tears in his eyes that night." Vernon arranged a small memorial service that Sunday evening at the new gravesite, where a large tent had been set up and lighting installed by George Coleman above the freshly dug graves. Only a small number of close friends and family attended the service, and Nancy remembered that there seemed to be more funeral home staff than family and friends. Folding chairs were set up for Vernon, Aunt Delta, and Dodger near the graves. Aunt Delta and Dodger were seated before the service began, and Vernon joined them after watching the caskets being unloaded from the white hearses. The 2 hearses were carefully backed up along the service drive directly in front of the meditation garden. Nancy remembered the small service beginning around 7 p.m. as the sun was setting. The cool October air and bright lights from the funeral tent made the somber moment feel even more surreal. From near the swimming pool, she watched the funeral home workers place Elvis's casket on a cart and wheel it to the grave, with the quiet moment broken only by distant traffic from Elvis Presley Boulevard below. Nancy noticed that Elvis's casket still looked shiny from the earlier funeral, but what surprised everyone was that Gladys's casket, buried since 1957, also appeared shiny and new. Gladys's casket had been protected in an expensive vault for years, and was also touched up by cemetery workers before being brought to Graceland. Vernon later told George Coleman that he had carefully inspected both caskets at the cemetery and that he had only seen one small spot of rust on one of the handles on Gladys's casket. Gladys's casket was placed on the lowering straps over the grave, followed by Elvis's casket. Once the workers stepped away toward the hearses, the service began. Nancy did not remember who led the service, only that it was brief and simple, because Vernon wanted to spare the family any additional emotional strain. After a short final prayer, the family and friends walked back toward the house as the funeral attendants hit the two buttons simultaneously, releasing both caskets and allowing them to sink slowly into the waiting vaults. Nancy writes, Vernon made it to about the corner of the swimming pool, stopped and briefly looked back for the last time at the two people he cared about more than anyone else in the world. With tears in his eyes, he straightened his shoulders, turned back toward the house, and walked away. He told me the next day that had been as hard an ordeal for him as when he first buried Elvis 6 weeks before. Vernon said, Elvis and his mother are now home again, this time for good. That's the way it should be. Vernon also said that the reburial brought him some measure of peace, something he deeply needed. Having Elvis and Gladys buried at Graceland meant Vernon could visit their graves privately without the constant intrusion of fans that had occurred at Forest Hills Cemetery. Nancy writes, even though Elvis was no longer with us, we could at least take comfort that his remains were now home. Graceland would never be the same again. That's it for Chapter 9. Stay tuned for Chapter 10, which is titled Life After Elvis. It's going to be the final chapter. See you then.